orders and reduction of inventory reduces profits. Profits means that there's a tightening of companies and small businesses. Tightening ultimately affects employment. Unemployment typically rises, which introduces the full cycle. Hey gang, Greg Barron here again today. Thanks for joining us on our YouTube channel. I'm going to start off with an analogy, and I'm going to take you back to the mid-1960s when the Vietnam War was raging, and there was a pilot by the name of James Stockdale. Stockdale was flying a Navy A-4 Skyhawk over Vietnam. He parachuted into a small village where they promptly took him to the authorities, and he ended up in the infamous Hanoi Hilton, one of the worst prisoner of war camps in history. There he was brutally beat over 7 years. Twice his leg was broken, where he infamously became the most senior naval officer to be ever held captive as a prisoner of war. Now, you're probably asking, what does that have to do with current financial trends? And I do have an analogy, because when he was set free, a reporter asked him, who are the ones that didn't get out? And he famously said, well, that's easy, those who are the optimists. He went on to say, and I'll read, "You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality." The reason I bring that up today is we are currently looking at very fragile markets and an economic landscape that's infinitely hard to predict. But it's our natural desire to be optimists. Politicians want us to remain optimistic. It's politically incorrect to talk about negative things on a political landscape because it costs them votes. So as Admiral Stockdale says, you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, but you also must have the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your present reality. So that's where we start off today's discussion is, what are those brutal facts of reality, but yet how can we remain optimistic that we will prevail in the end? One of the most insightful strategists today that I've come across is a gentleman by the name of Michael Kantrowitz, and he is the CIO of Piper Sandler. I've had the opportunity to study Michael's framework, which he calls the HOPE framework or the HOPE cycle. And it's an acronym for these four things: housing, orders, profits, and employment. And Michael calls it a cycle because any time that the central banks introduce rate hikes to control or to manipulate monetary policy, we always have a lag effect, but have leading indices that give us an idea of when the velocity of money will work through each of these HOPE predictors to ultimately be able to help us determine when this lag effect will work its way through to set the table for an ultimate recession. So as quickly as I can, I want to go through the different acronym letters to be able to describe to you how it can be a predictor. But first, let me throw a chart up on the screen that will show you each of these letters in the acronym that spell out HOPE. And you can see by these peaks and troughs as an overview, you have housing, orders, profits, and employment. You had the peak of housing was in November of 2020. You have the peak of orders, which is in March of 2021. You have the peak of profits, which was in June of 2022, and now we're waiting for employment figures to come back. Each of these letters represents a progression. Now remember that a recession is not an event. A recession is progressive. There's not one day that's predictable, and sometimes this lag effect can take anywhere from 16 to 20 months. There's no exact science or predictive tool, but what we can do is take Michael's HOPE cycle and apply some data to it to be somewhat more predictive, to give us an idea of really how to prepare in a string of months, how close we are to ultimately entering the beginning of what we would call a recession. So I'm going to center on 4 specific data points. I'm going to give you some specific charts that you can track, and as quickly as I can, go down through the list so that you can continually update these as the months go by. First off, let's start with housing. Housing is always at the beginning of any upturn or downturn in the economy, primarily because this is the biggest piece of wealth for most anyone in the United States. Earnings don't improve until housing improves. Orders aren't placed unless housing is in production. This is a typical cycle that we always see. Profits don't follow unless orders work their way into the system. And if companies aren't making profits, they simply don't need as many employees. So you can see how this is a progressive cycle. So let's start with H. And there's two particular charts that you can watch to see the sentiment that's out there for housing. Now, when the first rate hike started in March of 2022, it really didn't affect housing till the summer. Housing peaked in the summer, and the lag effect of the first rate hike was about 6 months before housing started taking a dip. This, again, I'll refer to as the velocity of money that works its way through the system. There's always a lag effect that gives us an idea of ultimately where we're going to end up. So if we look at this chart, we can see that the peak of housing happened in November of 2020. And upon further observation, you can see that it had a few head fakes along the way before it really fell off the cliff. That's not unusual for any of these indices, as there's a stubbornness in the system and a psychological barrier that people have to really remain optimistic until finally it sinks in and it starts to fall over. The other thing that we can look at is the number of permits that are being issued. I recently looked at the Commercial Architectural Billings Report, and as of January and February, those numbers also are going negative. It's a good precursor to understand, is there a canary in the mine that we can look to of how these certain items can give us a predictive model to at least have some kind of idea of what's happening in the near future. And before we finish the rest of the letters in the HOPE framework, I have a question for you. If you would just reach out to me, I'd like to know, when do you think that we would be going into recession? Give me an opinion of how many months you think we are away from it. I'd love to see your comments. Now remember, this is a progressive cycle. So let's go to the O of HOPE, which is orders. And it makes sense when you think that orders naturally follow the uptick or the downturn as housing starts increase or decrease. So let me read to you a most recent article about manufacturing PMI or orders that just came out in early April. This particular article says, economic activity in the manufacturing sector contracted in March for the 5th consecutive month following a 28-month period of growth. It goes on to say that the March manufacturing PMI registered 46.3%. By the way, anything lower than 50 is a contraction. 1.4 percentage points lower than the 47.7% recorded in February. Regarding the overall economy, this figure indicates a 4-month of contraction after a 30-month period of expansion. So once again, we see a really good indicator of how the O of HOPE is reflecting that orders are now taking a downward slide, which is predictable with the housing market that also preceded that. I'll bring your attention to one more article about manufacturing, which was just released by Reuters in early April, which says U.S. manufacturing activity slumped in March to the lowest level in nearly 3 years as new orders plunged, and analysts said activity could decline further due to the tighter credit standards. The Institute for Supply Management, or ISM, which is a great survey, by the way, on Monday showed all subcomponents of its manufacturing PMI below the 50 threshold for the first time since 2009. Again, anything below 50 represents a contraction. It continues that 12 industries reporting contraction included furniture and related products, non-metallic mineral products, textile mills, transportation equipment, and computer and electronic products, as well as electrical equipment, appliances, and components. Really, the only two that weren't affected of the 6 largest were petroleum and coal products, as well as machinery. So as a total group of produced items, very few of them did not experience a significant contraction in the last few months. So historically, after any Fed fund rate hike that's significant, Typically, housing has a lag effect of approximately 6 months. Now, it could vary each side of that, but that's fairly typical historically when we look at the last few recessions that have occurred. Orders, on the other hand, typically have a lag period of somewhere up to an average of 16 months. This has a much longer lag time as this velocity of money works its way through the system. If you remember right, I said that the first rate hike was in March of 2022. 16 months from March of 2022 is right about where we are today. Now, looking back at the hope cycle again, looking at the letter P for profits, remember this is progressive. The peak of earnings for companies was in June of 2022. There's also a really good data point that you can look at called the Small Business Optimism Index. This is put out by the National Federation of Independent Businesses. These are all small companies, and this data dates back to the 80s. So this has great information to correlate data that we're discussing today. As you can see by the Small Business Optimism Index, it has fallen to one of the lowest points since 2009 when we entered the Great Recession of our era. So as we're looking at this whole framework, you have to understand that there's never just one data point that leads you to some kind of predictive outcome. But using this hope framework, you can see that as you progress, as the Fed tightens, it does move from one segment to the other in a very progressive way. And these lagging indicators show us from a macro level a really good correlation as it moves through it. So as we talk about the P in profits, why is the S&P still at 4,100? Why is the market still at the high that it is? And I would submit to you that it is showing signs of structural failure under the surface. There are certainly some industries that are showing signs of weakening, and we will continue to see a fall in earnings, which will obviously reduce profits, which will lead us to the next lagging indicator, which is employment. Typically, the very last indicator to go, which usually introduces a recessionary period, is employment. And if you think about it logically, it totally makes sense. Housing reduces orders. Orders and reduction of inventory reduces profits. Profits means that there's a tightening of companies and small businesses. Tightening ultimately affects employment. Unemployment typically rises, which introduces the full cycle, which usually takes around 16 to 20 months from that first monetary change at the central bank, which ushers in a recessionary period. So where are we right now? As you can see by the chart, unemployment has gone down, and now it's just moving sideways. It's having a couple of head fakes, and what we're really looking for is the rest of the earnings to continue to slide to where unemployment will start to tick up. When you see unemployment start to tick up, that will be your indication to know that we will be in for a harder recessionary period. So in summary, I would say that we have all the preconditions for recession. Again, I go back to the beginning of the analogy of Admiral Stockdale. You have to address the brutal facts of reality. But at the same time, you always have to have the faith that you will prevail in the end. That's what they call the Stockdale Paradox. I do believe that we are months away from unemployment to start to tick up. I do believe that we will still move into a recessionary period, but I also believe that in every transitionary time, it's also an opportunity if you have kept your house in order, if you have kept your powder dry, if you continue to educate yourself and lean into what Warren Buffett said, be fearful when others are greedy and be greedy when others are fearful. Hey, if you like the content, be sure and like and subscribe. It does help us a lot. Be kind to somebody today, and we'll see you next time. And the acronym for HOPE stands for these four things: housing, and it's an acronym, for HOPE, Duh. And it's an acronym for, and as Admiral Stockdale says, you must face your current, and as Admiral Stockdale, and as General First Lieutenant Private Stockdale